What happens when a king who rules the world is haunted by the ghost of a single, undefeated adversary? Picture this. The year is 331 BC. On a vast, sun-scorched plain, two worlds are about to collide. On one side, the largest army ever assembled, a multi-continental host led by Darius III, the King of Kings, ruler of an empire that has known no equal. On the other, a young, audacious conqueror from a kingdom of mountains, a man who calls himself the son of a god, Alexander of Macedon. This is not a battle for a border or a province. This is a battle for the world itself, a final, apocalyptic showdown where the victor will not just win a war, but will inherit history. This is the story of Gaugamela. Before the dust settled on the plains of Gaugamela, a storm had been brewing for 2 long years. The ancient world was already reeling from the shock of the Battle of Issus, where the seemingly invincible Persian host had been shattered, and its great king, Darius, had been sent fleeing in disgrace, abandoning his own family to the mercy of the Conqueror. That victory had given Alexander not just treasure, but a foothold. He had spent the intervening years systematically dismantling the western edge of the Persian Empire, seizing the legendary wealth of Egypt and being crowned its pharaoh. Yet, in the grand palaces of Babylon, the Persian lion was not dead, merely wounded and enraged. Darius, stung by his humiliation and driven by a desperate need to restore his honor, had summoned the full, terrifying might of his remaining domains. He had learned the bitter lesson of Issus, where the terrain had been his enemy. This time, he would choose the ground. This time, there would be no excuses. He gathered a force so immense it defied belief, on a plain so wide it seemed to touch the horizons. He was not just preparing for a battle, he was orchestrating an annihilation. Against this backdrop of imperial vengeance and divine ambition, Alexander marched east, pushing his veteran army to the limits of human endurance, seeking the one thing that would grant him the world: a final, decisive confrontation with the King of Kings. Before we march into the heart of this epic conflict and witness the tactical masterclass that reshaped the world, secure your place in the ranks. Strike the subscribe button like a companion cavalry charge and enlist in this legion of history lovers. You won't want to miss the campaigns to come. The imperial tent was a world unto itself, a cavern of silk and gold thread that smelled of incense and old power. Darius III, King of Kings, sat upon a gilded throne as a dust-streaked messenger knelt before him, the man's breath coming in ragged gasps. The news was a poison on the air, a single stark fact that had traveled across the plains to find him here, at Gaugamela. Alexander of Macedon was coming. He was not weeks away, nor days. He was imminent. Darius rose, his heavy robes of state rustling like a field of dry reeds. He moved to a great map table, its surface a mosaic of polished stone and inlaid ivory depicting the sprawling expanse of his empire. His finger, adorned with a heavy signet ring, traced a path from the heart of Persia to this very spot, a journey that should have been impossible for the upstart king and his band of mountain men. A low, rumbling laugh escaped his lips, a sound meant to convey an assurance he did not entirely feel. He spoke of his army, a host so vast it could drink the rivers dry, and whose marching feet could shake the very foundations of the earth. 200,000 infantry, 40,000 cavalry, and the pride of his military might, scythed chariots and towering war elephants from the easternmost provinces. Numbers were his comfort, his shield, the undeniable arithmetic of supremacy. Yet, beneath the booming declarations and the confident sweep of his arm, a cold unease coiled in his gut. It was the shadow of a memory, the ghost of Issus, where this same Macedonian wolf had torn through his lines and sent him fleeing from his own family. The memory was a stain on his royal dignity, a private shame that festered beneath the public bravado. His advisors, old men with faces like cracked leather, murmured cautious words. They spoke of the Macedonian Phalanx, its sarissas forming an impenetrable forest of bronze and iron. They whispered of Alexander's speed, his unpredictable genius, his ability to turn the very ground into a weapon. Darius waved a dismissive hand, the gesture too sharp, too quick. He would not hear of tactics when he commanded the weight of continents. Strategy was for the outnumbered, for the desperate. He was the heir to Cyrus, to Xerxes. His will was strategy enough. His orders were issued not with the precision of a master tactician, but with the grand, sweeping gestures of a man who believed the universe itself bowed to his command. He commanded the field to be cleared and leveled for his chariots, a vast, flat plain where his numerical advantage would be absolute. He positioned his troops in deep, traditional formations, a wall of humanity and steel meant to overwhelm through sheer mass. There was no cleverness in the deployment, no attempt to counter the specific threats he had been warned of. It was a plan born of hubris, a reliance on the crushing weight of his empire to simply flatten the problem. As his generals scurried to enact his will, Darius stood alone in the center of his opulent tent, the king of kings in a palace of silk, listening to the first faint tremors of an approaching storm. A different kind of king stood before a different kind of army. Where Darius held court in silken isolation, Alexander walked among his men, his presence a current of energy that crackled through the Macedonian ranks. He stood on an outcropping of rock, the wind tugging at his short sandy hair and the simple white cloak he wore over his polished bronze cuirass. Below him, faces weathered by sun and scarred by battle looked up, not at a distant god-king, but at a leader who had shared their hunger, their thirst, and their every victory. He did not need to shout. His voice, clear and resonant, carried the weight of absolute conviction, and the army fell into a silence so profound the only sound was the whisper of the wind over the plains of Gaugamela. He began not with boasts of their strength, but with a reminder of their shared journey. He spoke of the Granicus River, where they had first tested their steel against the satraps of Persia, and of the cliffs of Halicarnassus, scaled under a hail of arrows. He reminded them of Issus, where they had broken the great host of Darius and sent the King of Kings fleeing in his chariot, leaving his own mother, wife, and children behind as captives. Each memory was a thread woven into a tapestry of invincibility, a chronicle of the impossible made routine. Then his gaze swept across the sea of faces, and he spoke of tomorrow. He spoke of Persia not as an empire, but as a prize. He painted a vision of the wealth of Susa and the splendors of Persepolis, not as plunder to be looted, but as the rightful spoils for the bravest men the world had ever known. He spoke of glory not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing legacy they would forge together on the morrow. He was not asking them to fight for him. He was inviting them to conquer the world with him. A roar erupted from the Phalanx, a single thunderous voice of assent that shook the very air, a sound not of fear, but of ferocious anticipation. Later, within the practical confines of his command tent, that fiery orator transformed into a master of geometry and force. Maps were unrolled, not of ivory and stone, but of durable leather, marked with the precise, practical notations of a campaigner. His generals gathered around him, men like the seasoned Parmenion, his face a roadmap of decades of warfare. Alexander's finger, calloused and sure, danced across the hide, tracing the anticipated Persian formations. He explained his plan not as a hope, but as an inevitability. He would refuse his right flank, drawing the Persian cavalry into a premature and disjointed attack. The core of his line, the Phalanx, would advance like a slow, irresistible tide. Its sarissa points a bristling wall of death. And then he would strike. With his companion cavalry, his hammer, he would wait for the moment the Persian line stretched and thinned. And then he would drive a wedge straight into its heart, aiming not for a wing, not for a regiment, but for the man who claimed to be its soul, Darius himself. Parmenion, ever the cautious veteran, voiced the concerns of conventional warfare. The Persian numbers were staggering. Their front line was miles wide. What if the Phalanx could not hold? What if the Persian immortals broke through? Alexander listened, his expression one of intense focus, not dismissal. He acknowledged the risks, then dismantled them with a tactical foresight that bordered on prescience. He explained how the very size of the Persian army would be its weakness, that its command would be slow, its movements clumsy. He had studied the ground, the subtle rolls and depressions of the plain Darius had so arrogantly flattened for his own chariots. He would use every inch of it. His confidence was not arrogance. It was the product of a mind that saw the battlefield as a living chessboard, and he was already 10 moves ahead. As the meeting concluded and his generals moved to their posts, a sense of destiny settled over the camp. It was not the passive hope of men trusting to fate, but the active, electric certainty of men following a leader who carved his own. The dust of ambition tasted like grit and iron on the tongue, a constant choking companion to the Macedonian army as it marched east. The fiery certainty of Alexander's speech, still ringing in their ears, now met the grueling reality of the earth beneath their sandals. The land between the Tigris and the plains of Gaugamela was a sun-scorched expanse of cracked clay and thorny scrub, a territory that seemed to actively resist their passage. The sun was a merciless bronze disk, hammering the column with a heat that made the air shimmer and waver. Men marched in a waking dream of thirst, their waterskins long since light, their lips cracked and bleeding. The initial euphoria of conquest had been sanded away by the relentless grind of the campaign, replaced by the dull, aching focus required to simply place one foot in front of the other. Supply wagons, the lifeline of any army, moved at a snail's pace, their wooden axles groaning in protest against the unforgiven terrain. Rations were cut, then cut again. The men subsisted on hardtack that had to be soaked in what little water remained to be edible, and thin strips of salted meat that only deepened their thirst. The proud Phalangites, who had stood like a bronze wall before the king, now trudged with their sarissas shouldered, the great weight of the 18-foot spears becoming a personal burden under the oppressive sun. Morale, that most fragile of military assets, began to fray at the edges Whispers slithered through the ranks at night, not of the glory to be won, but of the cool streams of their Macedonian homeland, of the shade of familiar trees. The vast alien emptiness of Persia was a psychological weight as heavy as any pack. It was in this crucible of hardship that Alexander's leadership was forged, not in grand speeches, but in quiet, tangible action. He was not a distant figure borne aloft in a litter, but a man of the march. He walked among his men, his own cloak as dust-covered as theirs, his face as tanned and weathered. He refused the last of the water, pointing it toward a soldier stumbling with heat exhaustion. He helped push a mired cart out of a dry riverbed, his shoulders straining alongside the common soldiers. There was no performance in it, only a shared endurance that communicated more than any words could. Their suffering was his suffering. He moved through the ranks, a calm, steady presence, his gaze meeting theirs, acknowledging their hardship without pity, reinforcing their purpose without condescension. He was the anchor in their sea of doubt, his unwavering resolve a silent command to persevere. The tension broke with the arrival of the scouts. They came in on lathered horses, their faces etched with the urgency of their news. They bypassed the chain of command, riding straight for the king, who stood studying a worn map held down by stones. The scouts dismounted, their report delivered in low, rapid tones. The Persian host was no longer a rumor or a dot on a map. It was a reality, a living, breathing entity mustered on the plains ahead. They spoke of a sea of tents, of banners too numerous to count fluttering in the distance, of the glint of sun on acres of polished scale armor. They described the chilling sight of the war elephants, like walk-in fortresses, and the scythed chariots being readied, their blades sharpened for a harvest of men. The air around the command group grew thick and still. The abstract threat had solidified into an imminent, overwhelming force. The grueling march was over. The time for endurance was past. Now the time for battle had begun. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky salted with stars, casting a pale, ghostly light over the plains of Gaugamela. Under this spectral glow, Alexander moved, a shadow among shadows. He had left the camp's flickering fires behind, taking only a handful of his most trusted scouts and the silent, ever-present Hephaestion. The air was cold and carried the scent of dry earth and distant, unnumbered campfires from the Persian host, a smudge of orange glow on the eastern horizon that hinted at the immensity waiting for the dawn. This was no longer a matter of maps or reports. This was the ground itself, and Alexander needed to feel its texture, to read its subtle language beneath his feet. He walked the length of the anticipated battlefield, his steps measured and silent. His eyes, adjusted to the gloom, scanned the terrain that Darius had so arrogantly flattened. He noted the slight depressions, the almost imperceptible rises that his enemy had dismissed. To Darius, it was a perfect killing field for his chariots. To Alexander, it was a canvas of potential. He traced the path his phalanx would take, imagining the forest of sarissas advancing, a slow, deliberate beast of bronze and iron. He then turned his gaze to the flanks, his mind calculating angles of attack, distances for cavalry charges, and the points where the vast, unwieldy Persian line would inevitably stretch and strain. He was not just planning a battle. He was composing a symphony of violence, and every contour of the land was a note to be played. At his side, Hephaestion matched his pace, a solid, familiar presence in the vast, silent darkness. There was no need for words between them. Their shared understanding was a language of its own, forged in a decade of shared campaigns and unshakable trust. Alexander paused on a low ridge, looking out at the sea of Persian fires. He gestured, a single fluid motion of his hand, sketching the movements of the morrow in the air. It was not a speech for his generals, but a quiet confidence shared with his closest friend. He pointed to where the Persian cavalry would mass, predicting their impetuous charge, and then to the spot where his own companion cavalry would wait, a coiled spring of focused destruction. In that moment, he was not a king or a conqueror, but a craftsman revealing the masterstroke of his design. Hephaestion listened, his silence a profound agreement, his presence a reaffirmation of the bond that was as much a part of Alexander's strength as his own strategic genius. It was a moment of profound intimacy amidst the looming carnage, a testament to the human connection that underpinned the machinery of war. Returning to the Macedonian camp as the first hints of gray touched the eastern sky, the theoretical became concrete. The camp, which had been a place of restless anticipation, now stirred with a purposeful energy. Alexander moved with a new intensity, his night-born plan crystallizing into a series of sharp, precise orders. Messengers, their faces tight with the gravity of their task, darted to the tents of his generals. Parmenion received his instructions for the left flank, a holding action of monumental importance. The commanders of the Phalanx were given their depth in intervals, the geometry of the killing ground. The cavalry officers were told their exact positions and the specific signal for the hammer blow. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for doubt. Each man was a gear in a perfect lethal machine, and Alexander was the master engineer setting them in motion. As the final orders echoed through the ranks, a strange calm descended upon the young king. The work was done. The reconnaissance was complete. The plan was set. The pieces were in place. He stood before his tent, watching his army prepare for the dawn. The clink of armor being fastened, the soft shuffling of thousands of feet taking their positions, the whispered prayers to gods, both Greek and foreign. It was the sound of destiny being met head-on. The night's anxieties and the march's hardships fell away, leaving only a clear, cold certainty. The plains of Gaugamela were no longer just a place on a map. They were the anvil upon which an empire would be forged, and Alexander was ready to pick up the hammer. The rising sun caught the gilded horns of the war elephants first, turning them into blazing scepters of light, and then spilled across the plain, revealing an army that seemed to have been sown from the earth itself. From his vantage point on a raised platform draped with purple cloth, Darius III surveyed the living tapestry of his power. Rank upon rank of soldiers stretched to the horizon, a mosaic of shifting colors from the embroidered tunics of the Median cavalry to the scaled armor of the Babylonian spearmen. The air thrummed with a low, pervasive hum, the collective breath of hundreds of thousands, the jingle of harnesses, the creak of leather. It was a sound meant to drown out doubt, the audible proof of an empire's reach. He descended, his chariot of state drawn by Nisaean horses whose coats shone like polished jet. He moved through the formations at a stately pace, a king reviewing his living wealth. His gaze swept over the scythed chariots, their wheel hubs fitted with curving blades that glittered with malicious promise. He paused before the elephants, their immense, wrinkled bodies like walking fortifications, their handlers perched high on their necks, guiding them with subtle prods. To Darius, this was not merely an army, it was a force of nature, a deluge of men and steel that would simply wash away the Macedonian irritant. The sheer physical mass of it filled him with a warm, swelling confidence. The memory of Issus felt like a distant, bad dream, a fluke corrected by this overwhelming display. His senior general, a grizzled Greek mercenary named Patron, whose face was a web of old scars, dared to approach the royal chariot. He spoke in low, urgent tones, his words lost to all but the king. He pointed not at the impressive chariots or the towering elephants, but at the heart of the Macedonian line they knew would be there, the Phalanx. He spoke of its discipline, its interlocking shield wall, its terrifying forest of sarissas that would render a frontal assault a bloody futile exercise. He suggested a feint, a withdrawal to draw the Macedonians out of their formation, to break their cohesion on the vast plain. Another advisor, a Persian noble with worried eyes, murmured agreement, suggesting the cavalry harass the flanks and rear, to bleed Alexander's army slowly rather than meet it in a single, crushing embrace. Darius's face, moments before a mask of serene power, hardened. The suggestions were an affront, a whisper of weakness. He turned his head slowly, his eyes passing over the men who had spoken as if they were insects. His voice, when it came, was cold and flat, cutting off further counsel. He declared that the might of Persia did not retreat, it did not faint, it did not harass, it advanced, it crushed. The numbers were the strategy. The weight of metal and muscle was the plan. To even consider the tactics of the outnumbered was to admit a frailty that simply did not exist in his world. The advisors fell back, their faces grim. The wall of the king's arrogance was impenetrable, a fortress more formidable than any the Macedonians could build. He gave his final orders from the chariot, his voice carrying across the front ranks. They were simple, direct, and utterly devoid of tactical nuance. The line was to advance. The chariots were to charge at the first opportunity and carve through the Macedonian center. The cavalry was to envelop the flanks. It was a plan from an older age, a sledgehammer meant for a nut. As he turned his chariot to return to his command position in the secure center, surrounded by his royal kinsmen, he felt a surge of triumph. He saw only the spectacle of his own invincible host, a vision so grand it blinded him to the fatal rigidity of his thinking, to the clever, adaptable enemy who even now was watching and waiting for the sledgehammer to fall. The Persian army stood ready, a magnificent, sprawling beast of war, shackled to the hubris of its master. The two armies settled upon the plain like two great beasts crouching in the deepening twilight, their campfires flickering like a galaxy of rival stars separated by a narrow, dark gulf of no man's land. On one side, the Persian fires were a sprawling, chaotic constellation, their light reflecting off the gilded trappings of chariots and the ornate armor of nobles, the air thick with the scent of exotic spices and the lowing of war elephants. On the other, the Macedonian camp was a tighter, more disciplined grid of flame, the light glinting dully on well-worn bronze and the practical lines of stacked sarissas, the air carrying the simpler smells of cooking grain, leather, and tired men. The space between them was charged with a silent, immense pressure, a vacuum waiting to be filled at dawn with the thunder of hooves and the screams of the dying. In the Macedonian camp, a profound and unexpected quiet settled around the king's tent. While his officers made their final rounds and his men sharpened swords and checked armor with nervous, repetitive motions, Alexander, having issued every conceivable order, did the one thing no one anticipated. He slept. He lay upon a simple campaign cot, his breathing deep and even, his features in the dim light smoothed of the day's intense calculation. There was no tension in his limbs, no restless turning. It was the sleep of absolute resolution, a complete and total trust in the plan he had crafted and the men who would execute it. A guard, peering through the tent flap, reported the sight in a hushed, reverent tone, and the news spread through the ranks like a calming balm. Their king was not pacing, not fretting over the odds. He was at peace. His calm was a silent sermon, more powerful than any speech, telling every phalangite and cavalryman that the morrow was not a day of fear, but a day of destiny, and their leader was so certain of their shared fate that he could embrace the stillness that preceded it. Across the plain, in the heart of the Persian encampment, no such peace could be found. Darius III sat in the suffocating opulence of his tent, surrounded by the tangible proofs of his power: chests of gold, silken carpets, incense burners wafting fragrant smoke. Yet the grandeur had become a cage. Every rustle of the tent flap sounded like the charge of the companion cavalry. Every distant shout from his own camp felt like the beginning of a panic. He paced the length of the silken enclosure, his mind a whirlpool of doubts and recriminations. The memory of Issus returned with vicious clarity. The sight of the Macedonian line holding, then advancing, the terrifying focus of Alexander himself driving toward his chariot. The sheer mass of his army, which had felt so comforting in the sunlight, now felt like a liability in the dark, a vast, unwieldy monster that would be slow to react, difficult to command. He tossed upon his lavish bedding, sleep a treacherous ally that offered only fractured visions of broken chariots and collapsing lines. He saw the stoic faces of his dismissed advisors, their warnings now echoing with the ring of prophecy. What if the Phalanx could not be broken? What if the scythed chariots, his great pride, were neutralized as Patron had feared? The psychological weight of command, which Alexander wore like a light cloak, crushed Darius beneath its enormity. He was not just a king fighting a battle. He was an empire fighting for its existence, and the terror of being the man who lost it all was a fever in his blood. His restlessness was a physical manifestation of his strategic uncertainty, a stark contrast to the serene faith emanating from the enemy camp. As the night wore on, the contrasting atmospheres of the two camps solidified the thematic chasm between their leaders. In one, a quiet confidence born of shared hardship, an unwavering belief in a single, brilliant mind allowed for rest. In the HUBRIS, other, isolated by hierarchy and hubris, a king was devoured by the very scale of his own power, his fear a poison seeping into the morale of his command structure. The eve of battle was not merely a pause in the action, it was the final, silent contest of wills, a psychological prelude where the calm resolve of one king began to eclipse the frantic anxiety of the other long before a single sword was drawn. The first sliver of sun cut across the plain of Gaugamela like a drawn blade, illuminating a world transformed. The night's tense silence shattered into the cacophony of an army rousing itself for slaughter. In the Macedonian camp, the final ritualistic acts of preparation unfolded with a grim efficiency. Men fastened bronze greaves to their shins, settled helmets over their brows, and took up the heavy oxhide shields, their hands gripping the familiar worn leather. The sarissa bearers assembled their weapons, the long shafts clicking together as they formed the ranks, creating a moving thicket of iron-tipped death. Across the field, the Persian host stirred like a great, multi-limbed beast awakening. The glint of the sun on countless scales of armor and the gilded trappings of chariots created a dazzling, intimidating spectacle, a sea of shimmering light and color that seemed to pulse with a menacing life of its own. The air grew thick with the scent of oiled leather, horse sweat, and the dry, metallic tang of fear. The initial movements were cautious, a slow, deliberate advance as the two colossal forces measured the distance between them. Then, the first clash erupted not in the center, but on the fringes, as light cavalry from both sides surged forward in a series of probing, furious skirmishes. The thundering of hooves was a sudden, violent drumbeat against the earth. Horsemen swirled around each other in a deadly dance, javelins flashing through the morning air, their flight followed by the sickening thuds of impact. Men were plucked from their saddles, their cries lost in the general roar. It was a chaotic, swirling preamble to the main event, a test of nerve and agility where the fates of individual warriors were swallowed by the larger, impending storm. From the heart of the Macedonian right wing, a focused energy coalesced. Alexander, astride his great horse Bucephalus, was a figure of galvanizing intensity. He wore a polished iron helmet with a white plume, a beacon for his men. With a raised hand and a sharp cry that was carried down the line, he signaled the advance of his elite companion cavalry. This was not the wild charge of the skirmishers, but a controlled, powerful thrust, a spear point aimed at the heart of the Persian left. Bucephalus surged forward, and with him came the finest horseman in the world, a wedge of muscle, steel, and unwavering loyalty. Their charge was a statement, a deliberate challenge thrown at the face of the Persian nobility who held that flank. The ground trembled under the coordinated hammer of their hooves, a rhythmic, terrifying promise of the violence to come. The Persian response was swift and terrifying. A cloud rose from the depths of their formation, darkening the sky. A swarm of arrows so dense it seemed to blot out the sun. The air itself began to hum, then whistle, and then scream as the deadly rain descended upon the advancing Macedonians. For the Phalangites in the center, the test was immediate and brutal. The command echoed down the line, and a forest of sarissas tilted skyward as thousands of shields were raised overhead, interlocking to form a protective shell, the fabled synaspismos. The arrows struck with a sound like hail on a bronze roof, a relentless percussive drumming. Men huddled beneath their shields, their world reduced to the din of impacts and the occasional choked cry as a shaft found a gap in the armor or a vulnerable limb. It was a trial of discipline against the chaos of indiscriminate death, a moment where raw courage was the only defense against the impersonal arithmetic of ranged slaughter. Within that maelstrom of whistling steel and splintering wood, individual moments of terror and resolve played out. A young soldier in the front rank, his knuckles white on his sarissa, felt a hot, searing pain as an arrow grazed his cheek, the warmth of his own blood a shocking contrast to the cold fear in his veins. Beside him, a grizzled veteran stood immovable, his jaw set, his eyes fixed ahead, his body a rock against the storm, his very stillness a bulwark for the trembling youth next to him. The noise was overwhelming, the shriek of missiles, the shouted commands of officers, the screams of the wounded, the frantic whinnying of horses. In the face of this chaos, the Macedonian discipline held, a testament to years of training and the unshakable belief in the man who led them. They advanced step by agonizing step into the arrow storm, their fear mastered by a courage forged in the fire of 100 such moments, trusting that their king's hammer would soon fall. The Persian war drums beat a frantic, thunderous rhythm, a sound that seemed to vibrate up from the very earth, and in response, the heart of Darius'S battle line shuddered into motion. From the gaps in the glittering ranks of spearmen, the scythed chariots burst forth. They were a vision of archaic terror, their wheel hubs fitted with whirling 6-foot blades that caught the morning sun, turning them into wheels of spinning, reflected fire. The drivers, faces set in grim masks, whipped their teams into a frenzied gallop, aiming their deadly charge straight for the seemingly rigid center of the Macedonian phalanx. This was Darius's masterstroke, his solution to the forest of sarissas, to mow the Macedonian infantry down like wheat before the scythe, to carve bloody avenues of chaos through their unbreakable line. But Alexander had not spent the eve of battle in restless anxiety. He had spent it in calculation. He had foreseen this exact moment, this reliance on a weapon of spectacle over substance. As the chariots closed the distance, kicking up a storm of dust and dread, the Macedonian response was not panic, but a series of preordained, fluid maneuvers. The front ranks of the phalanx held their ground, their sarissa points lowering to form an impassable, bristling wall. But behind them, the supporting ranks did not simply stand and watch. At sharp, whistled commands from their officers, the tightly packed formations deliberately parted, creating precisely measured lanes, like channels carved for a deadly river. The discipline was breathtaking, a testament to years of drilling that had turned thousands of men into a single, thinking organism. The chariots, committed to their headlong rush, had no choice but to plunge into these newly opened gaps. Their momentum, their greatest asset, instantly became their doom. The drivers found themselves hurtling through narrow corridors of Macedonian soldiers, the lethal scythes on their wheels passing harmlessly through empty air, where moments before a solid wall of men had stood. They were funneled into a trap. As they sped through the lanes, the Macedonian javelineers and lighter-armed hypaspists, positioned for this very purpose, unleashed a storm of projectiles. Javelins and stones rained down on the drivers and horses from point-blank range. Teams collapsed in a tangle of screaming horseflesh and splintered wood, the chariots cartwheeling into ruin. Those few that survived the gauntlet found themselves isolated and disoriented in the rear of the Macedonian formation, where they were swiftly surrounded and butchered by reserve troops. Darius's great terror weapon was neutralized not by brute strength, but by intelligent, coordinated motion. From his position at the head of the companion cavalry, Alexander watched the disintegration of the chariot charge with a predator's focus. The battle was a living, breathing entity, and he was its mind, adapting its sinews and nerves to the flow of combat. Seeing the Persian left, where the chariots had launched, now momentarily destabilized and shocked by the failure of their vaunted weapon, he made a subtle but decisive shift. He did not commit his entire cavalry force to a single, overwhelming blow. Instead, he ordered a contingent of his Thessalian horsemen to press a renewed aggressive assault on that weakened sector, keeping the Persian commanders off balance and preventing them from reinforcing their center. It was a tactical adjustment made in the blink of an eye, a flicker of thought that redirected the course of thousands of lives. The momentum of the battle, which had moments before seemed poised on a razor's edge beneath the Persian arrow storm, began to tilt. The failure of the scythed chariots sent a visible ripple of uncertainty through the Persian ranks. Their grand traditional weapon had been rendered useless by Macedonian innovation and discipline. The confident, crushing advance faltered, replaced by a hesitant, stuttering movement. On the Macedonian side, the successful defense ignited a fierce, cold confidence. They had faced the monster of legend and found it to be paper and wood. The thematic clash was laid bare on the dusty plain. The rigid traditional might of a vast empire was being systematically dismantled by the flexible, adaptive genius of a new way of war. The first crucial shift had occurred. The anvil had held, and now the hammer began its swing. The battle had become a living, breathing beast, and Alexander was its mind, feeling every shift of its muscle, every tremor of its will. The Persian left, still reeling from the catastrophic failure of its scythed chariots, presented a tantalizing vulnerability, a crack in the magnificent facade of imperial power. But Alexander knew that to strike directly at a crack was to invite it to be sealed. He needed to widen it, to turn it into a chasm. His gaze, sharp and calculating, swept across the seething line of battle, and he saw the move as clearly as if it were carved on a game board. He would offer a feint. A piece of himself dangled as bait. With a series of sharp signals carried by trumpet and waving standard, he ordered a deliberate, controlled withdrawal of his far-right cavalry wing. It was not a retreat, but a calculated step back, a bending of the line that mimicked the first signs of collapse. The Thessalian horsemen, disciplined to the point of instinct, executed the maneuver with flawless precision, giving ground slowly, fighting a fierce rearguard action that sold the illusion of a breaking flank. The Persian commanders on that sector, their judgment clouded by the desire for a decisive victory and stung by the earlier humiliation of their chariots, took the bait with a hungry, unthinking fervor. They saw a buckling enemy and poured more and more of their own cavalry into the pursuit, determined to roll up the Macedonian line from the end. They were drawn away from the center like iron filings pulled by a magnet, their formations stretching, thinning, and becoming disordered in their eagerness to exploit what they believed was a fatal weakness. From his elevated command position, Darius watched the movement unfold. A thin, triumphant smile touched his lips. He saw his cavalry surging forward on the right, pressing the Macedonians back, and interpreted it as the beginning of the end. The scythed chariots may have failed, but the sheer weight of his numbers was now telling. He leaned forward in his chariot, his fists clenched in anticipation, ready to give the order for a general advance that would crush the life from Alexander's army. The hubris that had blinded him to his advisors' warnings now clouded his tactical vision, making him see only the victory he so desperately craved, not the trap being sprung before his eyes. But Alexander was no longer watching the feint. His entire being was focused on the point of decision. The Persian left center, weakened by the diversion of its cavalry, now stood exposed, its flank hanging in the air like an unguarded door. This was the moment. This was the anvil against which he would shatter the Persian army. He turned on Bucephalus, the great horse sensing the coming storm, and raised his spear. The white plume on his helmet was a stark beacon against the dust-choked sky. A single piercing cry left his lips, and the companion cavalry, held in check until this very second, transformed from a waiting force into a thunderbolt. They did not charge in a wild, headlong rush. They moved as a single, cohesive instrument of destruction, a wedge of man and horse and steel honed to a razor's edge. Alexander was the tip of that wedge, his personal presence a force multiplier that drove his men to a state of near fanaticism. They struck the weakened Persian flank with the force of a tectonic shift. The impact was not merely physical, it was psychological. The Persian infantry, already shaken by the failure of their chariots, now found the finest cavalry in the world crashing into their side. The line did not just bend, it buckled, then shattered. The neat formations dissolved into a chaotic scramble of individual terror. The Macedonian sarissas in the center, the anvil that had held firm against arrows and chariots, now pressed forward, pinning the Persians in place while Alexander's hammer blow fell upon them from the side. Darius'S triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a mask of dawning horror. He watched, frozen, as a section of his magnificent army simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. The neat, colorful blocks on his left disintegrated into a swirling, screaming mob. He could see the tiny plumed figure of Alexander at the heart of the storm, a vortex of destruction, carving a path straight toward the heart of his command. The effectiveness of the combined arms was devastatingly clear. The steadfast phalanx holding the line, the feinting cavalry creating the opportunity, and the decisive hammer blow of the companions exploiting it. It was a symphony of violence, and Alexander was its conductor. The King of Kings could only watch in dismay as the lines he had believed unbreakable splintered and broke, the very ground beneath his feet seeming to grow unsteady as the tide of his empire began to recede. The polished silver of Darius's royal chariot reflected a world coming undone. From his elevated position in the heart of the Persian formation, the battle was no longer a grand spectacle of imperial might, but a chaotic mosaic of collapse. The neat, geometric blocks of his army, so impressive at dawn, were now distorted and fractured. To his left, a gaping hole had been torn where Alexander's cavalry wedge had struck, a wound that was spreading, bleeding panic and disarray back toward the center. The air, once filled with the confident beat of war drums, was now a cacophony of screams, the clash of metal, and the desperate shouts of officers trying to stem a tide they could not comprehend. And through the swirling dust, Darius could see it, the direct path from that breach to where he stood, surrounded by his royal kinsmen. His center, the very core of his command, and the symbolic heart of his empire, was exposed. A cold, sharp clarity pierced the fog of his earlier arrogance. This was not Issus repeated. This was something worse. At Issus, the terrain had been a conspirator, the narrow coastal plain compressing his army into a useless mob. Here, on the flat ground he had chosen for his triumph, he was being systematically dismantled by a superior mind. The realization was a physical blow, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. Two warring impulses tore at him, each one a king's imperative. Honor, the ancient code of the Achaemenids, demanded he stand his ground. To flee was to be remembered forever as the king who ran, not once, but twice, from the same Macedonian wolf. His ancestors, the great Cyrus and Darius the Great, seemed to watch him from the shadows of history, their stone-carved eyes judging his mettle. But survival, the raw animal instinct to live, whispered a more compelling argument. If he fell, the empire fell with him. His capture or death would not just end a battle, it would end a dynasty. The Persian host, leaderless, would dissolve into a leaderless rabble, and everything he was sworn to protect would be lost. Torn between the ghost of his honor and the stark reality of his survival, his command became a reflection of his internal schism. He saw a contingent of his Greek mercenary hoplites holding firm against the Macedonian Phalanx, a small island of stability in the raging sea. A desperate, half-formed idea seized him. If he could launch a localized counterattack there, a sharp, powerful thrust, he could perhaps seal the breach, buy time, and reclaim the initiative. It was not a considered strategy born of tactical insight, but a gambler's throw, a reaction born of panic and indecision. He barked the order, his voice strained and shrill, to a nearby general. The command was rushed, lacking the specific direction or coordinated support it desperately needed. The Persian counterattack surged forward, a brave but disjointed effort. The mercenaries and a mixed brigade of Cardassian infantry drove into the Macedonian line with the fury of doomed men. For a few moments, it seemed it might work. The phalanx slowed, its advance checked by the ferocity of the assault. But Alexander's machine was too well oiled, too adaptable. Reserves, held back for this exact purpose, moved to reinforce the pressured sector. The Persian attack, launched without proper support and against an enemy that expected and could absorb such blows, quickly lost its momentum. It was swallowed by the relentless, grinding advance of the Sarissa points. Its brave fighters cut down or pushed back, their sacrifice achieving nothing but a brief, bloody pause. The failure was absolute, a perfect illustration of command in crisis when led by a mind divided against itself. The order had been given not from a position of strength, but from a place of terrified indecision, and the men on the ground had paid the price. The consequences of failed leadership were written in the broken bodies left in the wake of the futile charge, and the path to Darius's chariot now lay more open than ever. The moment of decision arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a cold, crystallized certainty in Alexander's mind. The Persian left was in tatters, its center exposed and reeling from the failed counterattack, a body convulsing after a mortal wound. The intricate dance of feint and maneuver was over. The time for the subtle knife was past. Now was the moment for the warhammer. Alexander's gaze, sharp as a falcon's, locked onto the distant, glittering center of the Persian host, where the royal standard of Darius fluttered above a chariot of gold. He saw not a king, but the keystone of the entire arch of Persian resistance. Remove it, and the entire structure would collapse into rubble. He wheeled Bucephalus around, the great horse responding to the shift in his rider's weight as if they were a single creature. He raised his spear, the cornel wood shaft a familiar, comforting weight in his hand, and pointed it like an accusing finger straight at the heart of the Persian Empire. There were no more complex signals, no nuanced orders. The command was simple, primal, and understood by every man in the companion cavalry. Follow me. With a cry that was less a shout and more a promise of violence, he kicked his heels, and Bucephalus surged forward. The companions, their blood already singing with the fury of the earlier clash, erupted with him. This was no controlled tactical advance. This was a typhoon, a focused storm of man and beast driven by a single, relentless will. The charge was a physical force that tore through the thinning Persian ranks. Alexander led from the very tip of the spear, a figure of terrifying inspiration. His white plume was a beacon cutting a crimson path through the enemy. He was no longer just a commander. He was an elemental force, his sword a blur of silvered light, his presence a shock wave that broke the spirit of those who stood before him. The royal kinsmen, the noble guards surrounding Darius, were brave men, but they were unprepared for this torrent of focused fury. They fought and died in a desperate, shrinking circle, their ornate armor no match for the brutal, efficient killing of the Macedonians. The air filled with the shrieks of dying horses, the crunch of splintering shields, and the panicked cries in a dozen languages as the very core of the Persian command structure was violated. From his chariot, Darius watched the storm approach. The plumed demon of his nightmares was no longer a distant threat on the battlefield. He was a reality, a whirlwind of dust and blood and iron closing the distance with terrifying speed. He could see the Macedonians' faces now, contorted in battle rage, their eyes fixed not on the soldiers in front of them, but on him. He saw his own bodyguards being hewn down, the protective ring around him collapsing inward. The cold clarity of his earlier dilemma vanished, replaced by a pure animal terror that seized his limbs and froze his breath in his throat. The weight of his crown, the judgment of his ancestors, the fate of his empire, all of it was swept away by the primal, overwhelming instinct to survive. Honor was a luxury for the living, and he was staring into the face of death. With a strangled cry that was lost in the din, he turned from the advancing terror. He grabbed the reins from his stunned charioteer, his hand shaking violently, and whipped the Nicaean horses. The royal chariot, a symbol of immovable power, lurched violently, its gilded sides scraping against the press of his own fleeing guards. He did not order a retreat. He fled. He abandoned his post, his army, and his royal dignity in a single, desperate act of self-preservation. The sight of the King of Kings turning his chariot and racing for the rear was a contagion, a psychological wound more devastating than any cavalry charge. The news spread through the Persian ranks, not as words, but as a visible, tangible collapse of will. The standard had fallen. The God-King had run. The battle, which had been a hard-fought contest of wills and tactics, turned in that instant. The Persian resolve, already strained to its breaking point, shattered completely. What had been an army became a mob, a frantic, leaderless flood of humanity desperate to escape the closing Macedonian trap. The Macedonian advantage was no longer just tactical. It was absolute, a tide of victory sweeping across the plain. Alexander's relentless pursuit of Darius was more than a military action. It was the pure, unadulterated expression of his drive for glory, a symbolic hunt where the conquest of a man meant the conquest of an empire. He had not just broken the Persian line, he had broken its spirit, and the path to the world now lay open before him. The sight of Darius'S gilded chariot fleeing the field was a siren's call to Alexander's very soul. It was the culmination of every hardship endured, every risk taken on the long march from Pella, the embodiment of the glory he had promised his men. The Persian king was a wounded stag, and Alexander was the hunter, his blood singing with the primal thrill of the pursuit. He did not pause to savor the collapse of the Persian center or to coordinate the mopping up of the shattered army. His world narrowed to the cloud of dust kicked up by the royal chariot and the team of black horses straining toward the horizon. With a sharp cry to his companions, he dug his heels into Bucephalus's sides, and the great horse, its coat lathered and its nostrils flared, surged forward with a fresh burst of speed, a final desperate reserve summoned for this ultimate prize. The chase became a blur of motion and dust, a frantic race across the corpse-strewn plain. Alexander leaned low over Bucephalus's neck, his eyes fixed on the receding target, his mind consumed by a single, burning purpose. The wind whipped tears from his eyes, and the din of the dying battle faded behind him, replaced by the thunder of his own heartbeat and the rhythmic pounding of hooves. He and his closest companions formed a spearhead of exhaustion and determination, cutting through the scattered remnants of the Persian rout. They passed abandoned wagons, discarded shields, and pockets of resistance that melted away before their ferocious advance. Every yard closed felt like a mile won, every moment bringing him closer to the prize that would seal his legend and end the war in a single, decisive stroke. This was the pinnacle of his ambition, the raw, unchecked drive for personal glory that had propelled him across the world, now within tantalizing reach. But the battlefield, even in victory, is a beast that demands to be fed and secured. From the chaotic Macedonian lines, a messenger on a foam-flecked horse was galloping with equal desperation, not after the Persian king, but after his own. Parmenion, the old general holding the hard-pressed left flank, had seen a disaster in the making. While Alexander's hammer blow had shattered the Persian command, a large and still cohesive force of Persian and Indian cavalry had broken through on the Macedonian left, threatening the camp itself and the vast treasure it contained. The victory, so brilliantly won, was on the verge of being plucked from their hands by a desperate enemy lunge at their undefended rear. The messenger's face was a mask of panic and urgency, his voice raw as he finally intercepted the king, shouting the dire news over the roar of the wind and the chase. Alexander reined in Bucephalus so hard the horse skidded on the bloody earth, its sides heaving. The sudden stop was a physical shock. He turned, his gaze torn from the vanishing dust cloud of Darius to the scene behind him. He saw the truth in the messenger's wild eyes and in the distant, frantic movement around the Macedonian camp. A war erupted within him, a brutal clash between the conqueror's heart and the commander's mind. Every fiber of his being screamed to continue the pursuit, to run Darius to ground and end it. The frustration was a white-hot spike driven into his chest, a bitter taste of a prize denied. He could almost feel the weight of the Persian crown, could almost see the submission in Darius's eyes. To turn back now felt like a betrayal of his own destiny. Yet, beneath the searing frustration, the cool, calculating stream of his strategic acumen flowed, undeniable and clear. He saw the entire battlefield not as a hunter, but as a king, A captured camp meant lost supplies, plundered wealth, and a devastating blow to morale. It could allow the scattered Persian forces to rally around a new standard. A secure victory today was worth more than a symbolic capture that might lead to a prolonged war tomorrow. The ambition of the man warred with the practicality of the general, and in that agonizing moment of choice, the general won. His jaw tightened, the muscles standing out like cords. He let out a sound that was half groan, half roar of sheer, thwarted fury, a raw expression of the colossal weight of command. Then, with a final longing look toward the empty horizon where Darius had disappeared, he wrenched Bucephalus around. The order was barked, short and sharp, devoid of all emotion, but the iron will to preserve what had been won. The chase was over. The consolidation of an empire had begun. The silence that fell over the plain of Gaugamela was a heavier burden than the roar of battle had ever been. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from the absence of war cries and the final fading moans of the dying. The sun, now high and pitiless, baked the earth, raising a shimmering haze from the carnage that stretched to the horizon in every direction. What had been a field of destiny was now a charnel ground, a sprawling canvas of broken bodies, shattered weapons, and churned mud the color of rust. The air, once charged with the electric tension of armies, was now still and foul, carrying the metallic scent of blood and the deeper, more sickening odor of opened viscera. Flies, the true victors of every battle, had already descended in black, buzzing clouds, their droning the new anthem of the plain. Alexander walked through this landscape of the dead, his polished armor and white cloak now spattered and stained, his face a mask of grime and exhaustion. The fiery energy that had propelled him through the charge and the chase was gone, replaced by a leaden weariness that seeped into his bones. His steps were slow, deliberate, as he moved between the heaps of the slain. Here, a Macedonian phalangite lay tangled with a Persian spearman, their bodies locked in a final, fatal embrace. There, a horse kicked feebly in its death throes beside its eviscerated rider. He saw faces frozen in snarls of rage, eyes wide with surprise, and mouths agape in silent screams. This was the cost of the glory he had so fiercely pursued, the arithmetic of conquest, written not in captured standards or royal titles, but in broken flesh and spilled life. A profound remorse settled in his chest, a cold, heavy stone of grief for the thousands, friend and foe alike, who would never see home again. Yet, intertwined with that grief was a thread of fierce, undeniable pride. He had done it, against impossible odds, with an army dwarfed by the enemy host. He had shattered the power of the Achaemenid Empire on this very ground. He had proven the superiority of his mind, the discipline of his men, and the force of his will. He was the master of the field, the king of Asia, in fact, if not yet, in formal ceremony. The sight of his own men, weary but victorious, moving carefully through the carnage to retrieve wounded comrades, filled him with a swelling admiration that tempered his sorrow. This victory belonged to them, to their courage and their sacrifice. His remorse was for the loss. His pride was for the achievement, a complex, swirling torrent of emotion that defined the true weight of kingship. He did not retreat to his tent to rest or to plan his next move. Instead, he moved toward the groaning epicenters of the field, where the army's physicians and orderlies had established makeshift hospitals. The scene there was one of controlled horror. Men lay in rows on blood-soaked cloaks, their injuries a catalogue of the battle's violence, gaping sword wounds, limbs crushed by chariots, bodies pierced by arrows and javelins. The air was thick with the smell of vinegar, herbs, and seared flesh as wounds were cauterized. Alexander moved among them, his presence causing a ripple of awe and renewed pain. He did not speak empty words of comfort. He knelt in the dirt beside a young soldier whose leg was being stitched, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder as the needle pierced his flesh. He helped another sip water from a canteen, supporting his head with a tenderness that belied his status as a conquering king. He called men by their names, remembered their deeds from past battles, acknowledging their individual sacrifice. In these simple human acts, he emphasized a profound truth often lost in the grand narratives of war: that leadership, at its core, is not about commanding from a distance, but about sharing the burden of suffering, about affirming the humanity that persists even amid the most dehumanizing slaughter. The cost of conquest was immeasurable, but in tending to its victims, Alexander was paying the first installment of his debt. The rhythm of the chariot wheels was a frantic, staccato beat of panic against the hard-packed earth, a stark counterpoint to the stately processional pace it had once maintained. Darius III clung to the rail, his knuckles white, his royal robes whipped into a tattered frenzy by the wind of his own flight. The gilded vehicle, a symbol of immovable power, was now a cage of shame hurtling away from the ruin of his empire. He did not dare look back. Behind him lay the roaring chaos of his disintegrating army, the triumphant cries of the Macedonians, and the plumed demon who had hunted him like an animal. Ahead lay only the empty, unforgiving expanse of the Mesopotamian plain, a mirror of the desolation growing in his soul. The loyalists who galloped alongside him, a pitifully small guard of Bactrian cavalry and a handful of nobles whose loyalty outweighed their sense, were not an escort, but fellow fugitives, their faces etched with the same stunned terror. As the miles unspooled and the sounds of battle faded into a haunting silence, the initial blinding terror began to curdle into a deeper, more corrosive despair. The physical flight was nothing compared to the internal one, a retreat from the man he had believed himself to be. The King of Kings, the shadow of God upon earth, the heir to Cyrus, was now a fugitive, his crown a phantom weight upon his brow. The memory of the battlefield replayed itself behind his eyes with cruel clarity. He saw not the grand, sweeping movements of armies, but the specific, damning moments of his own failure, the dismissive wave of his hand silencing Patron's counsel, the arrogant certainty with which he had deployed his host, the petrified indecision as Alexander's wedge tore into his flank. His hubris, once a fortress, now lay in smoldering ruins around him, and he was naked in its ashes. Each jolt of the chariot was an accusation. He had commanded the largest army ever assembled, on ground of his own choosing, and had been utterly, humiliatingly defeated. The realization was a void opening inside him, a cold, dark emptiness that threatened to swallow what little remained of his spirit. Yet, as the sun began its descent, painting the barren landscape in hues of blood and gold, a flicker of something else stirred in the cold ashes of his despair. It was not hope, not yet, but a raw, stubborn resilience. He was alive. The Macedonian wolf had not taken his head. The empire, though grievously wounded, was vast. To the east lay Bactria, Media. the distant, unconquered satrapies that had yet to feel the Macedonian tide. He still had loyal satraps, still had the treasury at Ecbatana, still had the symbolic power of his name. The fall of his pride was complete, but in its ruin, a harder, clearer understanding was being born. He had relied on the weight of tradition and the arithmetic of numbers, while Alexander had wielded the sharper tools of innovation, adaptability, and sheer, unbridled will. It was a lesson written in the blood of tens of thousands of his men, a lesson he had been too arrogant to learn before the battle. Now it was etched into his soul. He would not make that mistake again. He would regroup, not as the glorious Achaemenid monarch expecting the world to bow, but as a fugitive king learning the brutal grammar of survival. He vowed to himself, there in the dust of his flight, that he would find new armies, forge new alliances, and fight this war not as Darius the god king, but as Darius the man, desperate and dangerous. The spirit, though bent and scarred, was not broken. The flight was not an end, but a bitter, necessary beginning. The royal tent of Darius, once a sanctuary of Persian opulence, now served as the stage for a new world order. Silken hangings embroidered with griffins and lions formed a stark backdrop to the sweat-stained, blood-spattered Macedonian officers who stood within. The air, thick with the scent of sandalwood and victory, hummed with an electric anticipation. At the center of it all, standing not upon the gilded throne, but before it, was Alexander. His armor still bore the grime of battle, the scratches and dents a testament to the day's ferocity, but his eyes burned with a clean, untarnished fire. Around him, his generals, Parmenion, Craterus, Hephaestion, watched with a mixture of exhaustion and awe as a senior officer, his voice cracking with emotion, stepped forward. In his hands he held not a weapon, but a simple, heavy circlet of gold taken from the abandoned treasure of the Persian king. He did not place it on Alexander's head, but offered it, and as Alexander took it, a silence fell, deeper than any that had preceded the battle. He did not immediately claim the title. Instead, he turned from the symbol of power and walked out of the tent, his generals flowing behind him like a wake, and ascended a hastily constructed platform overlooking the vast Macedonian camp. Below him, the army had gathered, a sea of weary, triumphant faces illuminated by the flickering light of 1,000 torches. These were the men who had marched through hell, who had stood firm against a storm of arrows, who had broken the unbreakable. He held the circlet aloft, and the gold caught the firelight, blazing like a miniature sun. A single word thundered from his lips, a word that echoed across the plain and into history: Asia. The roar that answered him was primal, a cathartic release of all the tension, fear, and hardship they had endured. In that moment, he was not merely their king, he was their destiny fulfilled. He was Alexander, king of Asia. He let the acclaim wash over him before raising his hands for silence, his gaze sweeping across the Phalangites, the Hypaspists, the Thessalian and companion cavalry. He began to speak, his voice carrying effortlessly, not with the boastful tone of a conqueror, but with the profound gratitude of a commander who knew the price of victory. He did not speak of his own genius, but of their collective bravery. He named names, recalling acts of individual heroism he had witnessed. A soldier who had plugged a gap in the line, a cavalryman who had turned a certain route into a holding action. He spoke of the Granicus, of Issus, and now of Gaugamela, weaving their shared history into a tapestry of invincibility. He praised their discipline in the face of the scythed chariots, their courage beneath the arrow storm, their unwavering faith when the odds seemed impossible. He made every man feel that this victory and the title it bestowed belonged as much to the lowest foot soldier as it did to the king. But his vision extended beyond the blood-soaked field of Gaugamela. Having united them in the memory of their past glories, he now united them for the future campaigns that lay ahead. He spoke of the lands that still remained, of the distant, fabled cities of the East that awaited their arrival. He painted a vision not of endless war, but of a unified world, a fusion of Greek and Persian, where their courage would be the foundation of a new era. He was no longer just the king of Macedon leading an army of invasion. He was the lord of Asia, and they were the architects of a new empire. He promised them not just plunder, but a place in the eternal story of the world. His words were a carefully woven spell, transforming exhaustion into anticipation and satiating the thirst for glory with the promise of more. He was mending their spirits, reforging the bonds of the army into something even stronger, a single, unstoppable force ready to follow him to the ends of the earth. In his triumph, he offered them not an end, but a magnificent beginning, a lesson in leadership that would echo through the ages. True power lies not in subjugation, but in the ability to inspire and unite diverse souls toward a common, world-altering purpose. The true victory at Gaugamela was not measured in the moment the Persian line broke, nor in the flight of a king, nor even in the title of a new one. Its deepest resonance was a tremor that would travel through the bedrock of history, reshaping the contours of empires and the very soul of warfare. The plain, now silent and littered with the dead, was more than a graveyard. It was a classroom. The lesson it taught was stark and revolutionary, that the future belongs not to the most numerous, but to the most adaptable, not to the richest, but to the most resolute. The clash between the sprawling traditional host of Darius and the lean, innovative machine of Alexander was a paradigm shift made manifest in blood and dust, a definitive end to one age of combat and the brutal dawn of another. The ripple effects of that single, decisive day began immediately and spread outwards like cracks in a frozen lake. The Achaemenid Empire, a colossus that had bestrode the known world for 2 centuries, did not merely lose a battle. It suffered a catastrophic failure of its central nervous system. The psychological blow of Gaugamela was more devastating than any military defeat. The invincibility of the King of Kings was shattered, the divine mandate of his rule called into question by his own flight. Satraps who had trembled at the name of Darius now looked upon a power vacuum, their loyalty shifting from a broken symbol to the pragmatic reality of the Macedonian spear. The great administrative machine of Persia, once the wonder of the ancient world, now stuttered and faltered, its gears stripped by the hammer blow on the plain. Cities like Babylon and Susa would open their gates not after prolonged sieges, but in the shadow of the legend born at Gaugamela, a legend of a commander who could not be stopped by mere walls or numbers. At the heart of this seismic shift was the undeniable power of strategy over sheer force. Alexander's victory was a masterclass in the art of war, a symphony composed of feint, maneuver, and the decisive strike. He had demonstrated that a battlefield was a mind game, a a three-dimensional puzzle where terrain, psychology, and timing were more critical assets than the count of soldiers. The rigid hierarchical command of the Persians, reliant on the singular will of a distant monarch, was proven obsolete against the flexible, mission-based tactics of the Macedonians, where junior officers could adapt and react with the full authority of the king's intent. The scythed chariot, a weapon designed to terrorize and break undisciplined levies, was rendered a useless relic by simple, drilled maneuvers. The battle underscored that innovation, training, and the moral component of leadership were the new currencies of power, a lesson that would inform military thought for millennia to come. The ghost of Gaugamela would haunt future generals, a permanent warning against the hubris of believing that mass alone could guarantee victory. This legacy is not merely an artifact for historians to dust off and admire. It is a living mirror held up to the challenges of any age, a stark reminder of the consequences that flow from decisive moments. The same principles that decided the fate of empires on the plains of Mesopotamia apply to the boardrooms, political arenas, and personal crossroads of the modern world. To study past conflicts like Gaugamela is not an exercise in antiquarian interest. It is a vital inoculation against the folly of hubris. It teaches that overwhelming resources can be neutralized by a clever plan, that entrenched power is often the most vulnerable to a novel approach, and that the failure to listen to dissenting voices, as Darius failed to listen to his advisors, is often the first step toward a precipice. The dust of Gaugamela whispers a timeless warning. To navigate the complex battles of our own time, we must first learn from the echoes of those already fought, using the past to inform our present decisions and to guard against the arrogant certainty that has toppled greater men and mightier kingdoms than our own. The true legacy of Gaugamela is not carved in the stone of plundered palaces or stamped upon the coins of a new empire. It is written in the invisible ink of human consequence, a story told in the hollowed eyes of the survivors and the unmarked graves of the fallen. The brilliant tactics and the seismic shift in power were but the surface tremors of a deeper, more enduring truth, that every triumph, no matter how glorious, is purchased with a currency of suffering. The sun that rose on Alexander's new title as King of Asia set on thousands of households across 2 continents that would forever feel the cold absence of a father, a son, a brother. The plain, once washed clean by rain and time, would remain fertile not from water, but from the blood that had seeped into its soil, a permanent, silent testament to the cost of one man's world-altering ambition. Alexander's own legacy, burnished by the blinding glare of his victories, is forever shadowed by this human toll. The boy king, who became a god to some, became a bringer of widows and orphans to countless others. His drive, his genius, his insatiable thirst for glory forged an empire that stretched across the known world. But it was an empire welded together by violence. The very adaptability and relentless will that secured his victories at Gaugamela and beyond also contained the seeds of his own mythos's complexity. He was a unifier who conquered through division, a bringer of Hellenistic culture who trampled local traditions beneath the march of his phalanx, a leader who inspired fierce loyalty in his men while demanding they follow him into an endless series of wars. His story is the ultimate parable of ambition, a warning that the pursuit of eternal glory often comes at the expense of enduring peace. This is the final, most crucial lesson that echoes across the centuries from that dusty plain. The study of history, of battles like Gaugamela and figures like Alexander, must serve a purpose higher than the admiration of power or the analysis of strategy. It must be a compass for our own humanity. The chronicles of conquest and empire are not just records of what was achieved, but profound reminders of what was lost. They urge us to value the fragile, precious state of peace over the brutal certainty of war, to champion leadership defined by ethical foresight and compassion over that driven solely by the hunger for power. The ghosts of Gaugamela do not ask us to remember how to win a battle. They implore us to remember why we should avoid one. They call upon us to look beyond the glittering crown and see the blood on its rim, to hear beyond the triumphant cheers and listen for the echoes of the mourners. Let the dust of that ancient field settle not just on the pages of history books, but upon your own conscience. Let the story of hubris and its fall, of brilliance and its cost, guide your actions in the quieter, yet no less significant, battles of your own life. When faced with conflict, whether personal, professional, or political, let history be your guide not toward the path of overwhelming force, but toward the higher ground of wisdom and compassion. Strive to be the kind of leader who builds rather than breaks, who unites rather than conquers, and who measures success not by the territories subdued, but by the dignity preserved and the peace sustained. For in the end, the most enduring legacy we can leave is not one written in the blood of others, but one etched in the mutual respect and shared humanity that true wisdom and compassion alone can forge. The dust that settled on the plains of Gaugamela covered the remains of an empire. Darius, the King of Kings, would never command a great army again. Hunted as a fugitive in his own land, he would meet a pitiful end, betrayed not by his enemy, but by his own subjects. Alexander, in a gesture that was both respectful and politically masterful, would hunt down the kingslayers and give his fallen rival a royal funeral, positioning himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. The Battle of Gaugamela was more than a victory. It was an apocalypse for the Achaemenid world. It stands as perhaps the most perfect tactical masterpiece in military history, a battle still studied today as the ultimate example of how tactical genius, innovation, and inspired leadership can overcome impossible odds. But its true legacy was the birth of a new age. The victory shattered the boundaries between East and West, opening the floodgates for an unprecedented fusion of cultures. Greek philosophy, art, and language would spread across the ancient world, mingling with the deep traditions of Persia and Babylon, creating the vibrant, dynamic Hellenistic civilization that would forever change the course of human history. On that single, bloody afternoon, one world died, and another was born from its ashes, forged by the will of a young king who dared to call himself a god. The story of Gaugamela is a timeless lesson in leadership, ambition, and the terrible price of victory. If this journey into the mind of a conqueror and the heart of a dying empire has captivated you, honor the fallen by striking the like button and share this story with anyone who appreciates the grand scope of history. Let me know in the comments below. Do you believe Alexander's victory was the result of pure tactical genius, or did Darius's hubris ultimately defeat himself? I read every comment, and I'm eager to hear your verdict. And if you haven't already, Subscribe and ring the notification bell, because the story of Alexander is far from over. Until next time, stay curious.